So, just 2 words in French pour aider les personnes qui sont francophones, afin qu'ils puissent enlever leurs écouteurs pour quelques minutes. Voilà, donc mesdames et messieurs, nous sommes très heureuses d'être ici. Je suis très heureuse de présenter le panel sur les droits de l'enfant. And now I'll go back to English, I'm afraid, for my fellow French speakers. So over the last decade, the experiences of children in sport and those impacted by sporting events have become increasingly visible, and this platform and group of people has been critical to make this happen more visible. It has often been the case for, the wrong reasons, whether that's child labor, the sexual abuse of child athletes that we were, Nancy was referring to earlier, the forced displacement of families to give way to new infrastructure. All of these issues were in the news over the last years. Fortunately, many organizations, including, in this room, have been very strong in getting the attention and acting to change that, and that includes many sporting organizations. This panel will highlight 2 ways organizations are taking action through the work of UNICEF Japan and the International Netball Federation. And 2 of our other speakers will speak about some areas that need more attention and give us a direction and thoughts for our collective work in the future. Okay, you will also hear some more about children's rights, particularly on the right not to be sexually abused, in the next panel with our survivors panel. So there will be a little time for questions and answers at the end of the session. If your answer doesn't get to be answered, please approach our panelists during the breaks over the 2 days. A last word, you will notice that there are no children here. The time wasn't sufficient for us to have a meaningful process of consultation and engagement, but do expect that it will be the case. A number of organizations working in the field are interested to do so or propose that for the next year's forum. And after all, the Convention on the Rights of the Child will be 30 next year. So that's a good time for us to take stock and accelerate action, especially in this important field. So my panelists to the left will first hear from Hiromasa Nakai from the Japan Committee of UNICEF, who will present us the Children's Rights in Sport principles that were developed, and this is a spin-off of Tokyo 2020 Sustainable Sourcing Code. So Hiro will tell us more about what it is. Our second panelist is Clare Briegal. Clare is the CEO of the International Netball Federation, and I would say a champion of child safeguarding in sport. They've pioneered it, over the last years through their affiliates in 5 regions of this world. Our third panelist is James Esson, and I'm glad to say that we also are a gender-balanced panel. So our third panelist is James Esson, and James is senior lecturer at in human geography at Loughborough University in the UK, and he will speak about his research about children in football. And our last panelist will be Gretchen Kerr, who will share insights about child abuse in sports and suggest directions for our collective work in the next years. Gretchen, you have 2 hats as a researcher and an athlete welfare officer for over 25 years of experience. So I think we will benefit from this, dual, expertise and experience. So without further ado, let's start by you, Hiro. Can you tell us more about this intriguing? Yes?
Well, thank you, Anastasia, and thank you very much. Good morning. Let me start with the why we call it as a spin-off of well, by the way, this is the document which I'm going to talk about. I hope you have one of these already, but if you don't, it's there. Oh, it's okay. Sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. I hope everyone has it, but if you don't, it's there. So please take it. And let me start why we call this as a spin-off Tokyo 2020 Sustainable Sourcing Code. It is only because that it's all started in a workshop which was hosted by IHRB on this very topic of the Tokyo 2020 Sustainable Sourcing Code. As you may already well know, the Sustainable Sourcing Code does address a couple of the child rights issues, but not everything. That's what we realized. And that's where we started developing this one. I'm not going to eat it in details of what's there, because you can find it if you open it. But to finalize this document, we invited the Japanese government sports agency and the key central level sporting bodies for their comments, and also for their comments. And we got quite constructive comments to finalize it. And I would say, right from the beginning, their reactions were all positive. And to be honest with you, to our present supplies, I personally expected some sort of hesitation coming from some of the sporting bodies because of the contents there, as you may imagine. However, every single organization, including the government sporting agency, were very positive. And the reason, as far as I know, or as far as I heard, was that the Japanese sports society, including the government agency itself, was already has been already trying to develop a momentum of the agenda for sports for all agenda. And then particularly since the 2011, when the government introduced one of the very basic primary principle sports law called the Basic Act on Sports, and also their work to getting up toward the Tokyo 2020. And I understand that they found this as a tool to further help them advance the agenda. And so we launched this just 20 days ago, and then only a week after the launch, this government agency sent out a directive to hundreds of thousands of sporting bodies, and also the schools, all schools, starting from primary to high school, nationwide, a directive introducing this as a tool to advance that agenda. And also, one of the key sporting, key supporting bodies, which you can find here, is one of them, Japan Sports Agency, Japan Sports Association. They are planning to use this in the training session of the registered 190,000 coaches, hopefully starting from next year. So that sort of positive momentum is already being developed within the period of a week or so. So we initially look at this document as a child safeguarding document. And yes, it is still a child safeguarding document. But because of the positive environment, which I have just explained, already exists in Japan, it has now become a tool to advance more than the child safeguarding, namely to advance the agenda of the Convention of the Rights of Child of Article 31, the right to play, and also the SDG 3, health for all at all ages. So before concluding my first presentation, let me invite a couple of people who have helped us to develop this document, draft and develop this document. Some of them are here. First, Tak Yamazaki. Mr. Tak Yamazaki, please stand up if you. And now Sato and this and Lucy from UNICEF UK and Andre Franco from UNICEF headquarters. And then I'd like to express our wholehearted gratitude to all of them for their contribution. And also, to conclude my remarks, I'd like to congratulate all of those the people who are leading the Japan's sports society for their positive commitment to children and also to the athletes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiro. I mean, it was like right on time. Thank you for this very important contribution. Then I'll turn to you, Claire. Can you tell us more about your experience in developing and implementing child safeguarding in the Federation?
Thank you, Anastasia. Good morning, everybody. Clare Briegal, so from the International Netball Federation. For those of you that don't know the sport, it's played predominantly by women and girls. There's a picture of it going on, a little bit like basketball, where you throw a ball into a hoop, a net. And the difference is you can't dribble the ball, you can't run with the ball, so it's very much about teamwork, throwing and catching the ball, and you score through the net. So with that backdrop, that's quite helpful. So netball is played by over 20 million participants, and as I said, predominantly by women and girls. And today I'd like to reflect on 3 areas regarding the approach by our sport in relation to the safeguarding of our participants and the respect and support of the rights of children. So the first area is around governance and leadership. So as an international federation, we began our safeguarding journey back in 2012 when we were invited by UK Sport to attend Beyond Sport. From there, UNICEF invited us to be a part of an international learning set where we worked on the creation of the international safeguards on children in sport. Now, as part of that process, we undertook a self-assessment and realised that although some of our members had safeguarding policies in place, we as an international federation were lacking. So we began developing guidelines for our members based on the principles in the safeguards. And these guidelines for safeguarding and protecting children set out clearly what was expected of our member associations. And they begin with the words, INF acknowledges the duty of care owed by members and regional federations to protect, safeguard and promote the welfare of children. INF believes that all children and young people involved in sport, and in particular the sport of netball, have the right to participate in a fair, safe and quality atmosphere free from abuse or exploitation. So those would be words that would ring loudly in the ears of everybody in this room. And those guidelines, if they're helpful to anybody, are available to download from the resources section of our website. And we use those with all of our member federations to guide their safeguarding policies. So, working in this area has helped our board to better define our organisation's vision, which we set out in our strategic plan. And that is to be a socially responsible sports movement, recognised universally for our positive impact on people and communities around the world. Our mission is to promote empowerment by working with our members from grassroots to the elite by providing safe and supportive environments to develop life skills and to sustain growth. So for netball, safeguarding sits high on our agenda, and at our Congress in 2017, our members approved a change to our Articles of Association which added an additional fundamental purpose, which was to promote the safeguarding and welfare of all participants in netball. So I now move on to my second area, which is direct action. So when we began our safeguarding journey, we thought, as an IF, we can create policy and direction, but what else can we do to impact positively the rights of children? So we started with awareness building through our members at a biennial congress. Now, we have very limited resources. I sit jealously looking at FIFA, and whilst they have the huge responsibility and the expectation, they also have a little more behind them than we do. But we can do it through our partnerships. So our partnerships with the likes of UK Sport, the Australian Sports Commission, we've been able to provide training and tools to enable our members to develop their policies, and we've used the UNICEF Safeguards for Children in Sport and the implementation guide, and they've been enormously helpful. We then went further and considered our major events and the impact we have at our Netball World Cup and our Netball World Youth Cup. We decided that we would insist on our events appointing a welfare officer to take responsibility for the welfare of participants and to act as a focus for any safeguarding concerns. So the organising committee of our Netball World Youth Cup in Gaborone, Botswana in 2017 partnered with the Norwegian Olympic and Paralympic Committee, NIF, to develop a safe sport programme. This was led by the welfare officer, and it included training for volunteers on all aspects of safe sport. The programme provided trained counsellors who supported players throughout the event. Now, one of the dangers, one of the consequences of opening your eyes to safeguarding and what goes on in your own sport is you can't close them again. You see and you hear things that you're not proud of, and as an international federation, that's a very hard act to swallow. We have to present ourselves in the best possible light. We have an image to manage, but we can't turn away from those issues, whether it's peer-to-peer bullying, whether it's the facilities that we put our athletes up in our games if they're not right. Those are real issues, and that's where safeguarding and the welfare of athletes and human rights really comes home to me. What's our biggest challenge? My biggest challenge is making sure that tomorrow that netballer is safe and secure. It's you know, I can put all the worries of running the International Federation office to one side. I want to know that that athlete is safe, that individual, that child. And that's the hardest thing about this. What we learn through putting in these welfare officer roles is precisely where we need to act. And that can guide us in terms of what we need to do next. So now the requirements for organising committees to appoint a welfare officer is now embedded in our events bidding process and in our event implementation. So then moving on to my third area, and this is advocacy. This is the role that the International Netball Federation can play in promoting safeguarding and the rights of children in sport to the wider sporting community. So I sit on the International Safeguarding Children in Sport Advisory Board and actively work to promote this important area by speaking at events such as today and offering support to our fellow international federations as they begin their safeguarding journey. We've introduced the Safeguards to Sport Accord through the Spirit of Sport Accord Award and to the ARISFA, that's the Association of the IOC Recognised Sports Federations. So I extend our offer of support to work with those in the room today. Each time I find a new partner, I learn more about how we can positively impact the lives of children. So for me, I learn as much as I give. So, and this takes me back to my first theme, that of leadership and governance. So at our INF Congress in Liverpool next year at our World Cup, we're going to expand on our theme to consider broader aspects of responsibility as governors of the sport in relation to athlete welfare in competition, to include the whole area of mental health and well-being. So for us, our journey began in 2012, but in many ways, it still feels like we're at the beginning. So if that's a warning to those of you that are stepping onto the road today. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. It may be a warm invitation. Okay, now our third panelist that we've looked into, safeguarding through our first, panelist, which is really where the field is. So, in the where next questions, we thought it would be really important to hear from you, James, and given your research on children in football in particular.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to require some audience participation to make sure that you're all still wide awake. So it's coming, so keep that in mind. What I would like to do in the next 7 minutes, and I'll try and stick to 7 minutes, is to give you some insights from 2 projects that I've worked on with, and I'm currently working on with UNICEF UK, looking at protecting children's rights in football at a global level. Yeah, big project, big challenge, not a lot of money. Now, I'm going to begin with the first project, which tried to map the risks that children encounter in football globally. And I'm going to try and articulate the 3 key findings, and the 4th is a more subtle finding, with your participation. So first of all, if you can stand up, please do so in a second. If you can't stand up for whatever reason, you can raise your hand. If you think children should not migrate internationally for footballing reasons, please stand up. So children should not be allowed to migrate internationally for footballing reasons. It's not a trick question, it's just to get people's opinions, yeah? Yeah? Okay. So people who are sitting down, you think children should be allowed to migrate, yeah? For footballing reasons. If you stood up, please put your hands up now if this was because of human trafficking. Concerns about human trafficking, yeah? Good. Now, for the last 2 questions, please stand up if your opinion was based on speaking to at least 100 children in 3 continents, or reading research which spoke to at least 100 children from 3 continents. Anyone standing up? Okay, no. But crucially, they didn't stand up for the first point. Very crucial. And my final one, and I'm not going to ask anybody to stand up or show hands, this is a more personal reflection. If one asked those questions, you thought about a boy playing football, a white boy playing football, or somebody in Europe, just think about what that means. Yeah? What that means is that you're probably ignoring a lot of people globally, but also ignoring women. Yeah? How does that relate to our key findings from the first part of the project? The first one is that most of the discussions you hear in the media about children's rights is dominated by human trafficking. Stories about human trafficking and international migration. Most children are not involved in that type of movement. The majority of children who play football are not going to migrate internationally. They play either at school, at an amateur level in their local neighborhoods, or maybe they play at a national level. But they rarely migrate internationally. So why is there disproportionate focus on human trafficking? I make this point only because I'm not saying that human trafficking isn't important. I spent the last 10 years researching human trafficking in football. My point is that we need to be clear of what the problem is if we want to find solutions. The second point is that international migration does not equal human trafficking. We have to be very, very clear on this point. If we want to find a solution, we need to know what the problem is to begin with. Now to the 3 key findings. That was the more subtle one. Number 1, geography, place and scale. The reason why I asked about whether you'd spoken to hundreds of children around the world, in most cases our policies and regulations are not informed by a global geography. More importantly, they're not informed by an understanding of scale. Often, as someone mentioned before, we're at this level here, sport takes place at another level, at the individual level. There's a disconnect between global regulations and individual experiences of sports. That's the first finding. That matters because we often lose sight of sports' role in survival and development, a key element of the UNCRC. Second finding, where is the voice of the child? In so many of our regulations and policies, I struggle to find the voice of the child in their implementation, their design, and their origin. Yeah? Where is the voice of the child? That matters because if we don't have the voice of the child, how can we guarantee we're doing things in their best interest? Again, a key finding from the report is that those two elements are missing in the context of football regulations. The final one, which linked to my comment about who did you imagine when I posed those questions, links to one of the core principles underpinning the UNCRC, non-discrimination. I find it very hard to believe that our policies are informed by non-discrimination if, in our mind, we're excluding and ignoring the vast majority of the global population. How can that be possible? Okay. That was phase one and the key findings. Got 2 minutes? Yeah. In phase two, we were given the task by UNICEF UK to try to identify ways in which professional football clubs could better embed human rights in their practices, children's rights in their practices, and also to look for examples of clubs who are doing this. I don't have time to go into the methodology that we designed, but I'll articulate some of the key issues that we had when we're trying to do this. There are 3 key tensions that we found in our research. The first is that we've spoken today about the values of sport in a very positive way. What we haven't talked about is commercialization, which has now become a key element of sport. Also, competition and winning at all costs. Those 2 things often create a tension between what sports are trying to achieve and protecting children's rights. The next issue is most human rights kind of laws or even guidance and principles address states, not businesses and corporations. Yeah? And lastly, and this was touched on, I think, in the final panel, previous panel, sorry, was autonomy of sport. Sport is very often autonomous in many ways. How can we try and overcome this with the methodology? You're probably seeing where this is going to go. We combine the UNCRC with the UNGP as a framework to look at clubs and think, are your policies, practices, processes in line with those 2 instruments? Yeah? As a starting point. What did we find? Because this is being recorded, I'm going to actually change what I was going to say and say something slightly different. But a couple of things stood out. Number 1, clubs did not want to be part of this project. And that's something that we need to take very, very seriously. Children's rights scares football clubs. They're scared. Why are they scared? Because they think we're going to find something wrong. Yeah? Now that can work in your favor, actually. In terms of corporations and sponsorship, most of the time they're worried about what this means for them financially. Reputational damage. So it's not great, but that could potentially work in our favor. So that's one thing. Clubs do not want to be involved. Why does that matter? It matters because the clubs who did want to be involved, what we found was that they didn't have a clear and coherent children's rights policy in many cases. And when they did have a policy, it often sat on the bookshelf. It wasn't operationalized. Again, I think we need to realize that most clubs have very good intentions, I would say. I'm trying to be optimistic here. The issue is about implementation. Yeah? Even if a child rights framework is in place, is it being implemented? In most cases, it was a bit ambiguous. Second, and it relates to my initial point, clubs are often scared, to identify and evaluate human rights risks, as I said, because of fears they might be found to be doing something wrong. Why does that matter? It matters because if you don't identify and evaluate something, you can't put in place remedy mechanisms. Yeah? Another key point that emerged, and this may surprise you, is that clubs are really worried about parents. Really worried about parents. In terms of the rights of the child, their best interest and their voice, clubs tend to go to parents rather than the child themselves. Increasingly, parents have realized that football is a way to make money, and that, it may surprise you, but it's taking precedence over their children's best interests. Yeah? So a key area that clubs are worried about now is the role of parents. Again, that's not to say that parents all have bad intentions, but it's a really key area that clubs are worried about. And last but not least, there is a feeling amongst clubs that we've spoken to that commercial interests, interest in the best interest of the child, and regulations are not in line with one another. So a club's best interest might be to develop a child to their best potential, both educationally and in their sporting domain, but they need to make money. A child might want to play to the best of their ability, but they might also be living in a very impoverished context. They have the opportunity to migrate to a better place, but they can't do so because of FIFA regulations. Yeah? Again, to be very, very clear, I'm not bashing FIFA. The reality of the situation is that the regulations that we currently have, the interests of children, and the interests of clubs are currently not very well aligned. And it's leading to serious fundamental issues in terms of protecting children's rights. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think this makes a very good segue to our next, panelist. This really, what you're calling for is a child-centered approach that really looks at individual children's interests. So, Gretchen, to you.
Thank you very much. It's truly an honor to have this opportunity to be engaged in such an important forum. This morning I would like to focus on one particular human right violation, and that is around interpersonal violence. For some in the audience, you may be more familiar with the term child maltreatment or harassment and abuse, which are often used interchangeably with interpersonal violence. My starting point to this presentation is that sport has numerous potential benefits for children and youth, and yet to realize these benefits, we must ensure a safe environment. This is the fundamental necessity in order to make sport accessible and beneficial. Here are some examples of what's meant by interpersonal violence, and there are examples of these across virtually every country. No country, no sport, no gender, no race, ethnicity is exempt from experiences of interpersonal violence in sport. The media gravitates mostly to occurrences of sexual violence in sport, and for good reason. These are incredibly traumatic, potentially damaging experiences that deserve significant attention. It is also important, though, that we broaden our focus on interpersonal violence to other forms. And it's interesting to note from research that has gone on globally that the most commonly experience of interpersonal violence in sport amongst children and youth is psychological abuse or psychological violence. Next one. Now, this has received less scholarly and public attention for many potential reasons. One is that psychological abuse or emotional abuse tends to be normalized in sport. And what we mean by psychological abuse is a repeated pattern of yelling, personally insulting, demeaning, threatening, humiliating, derogatory comments. It can mean the physical violence not directed to the athlete, but for the purposes of intimidation, or the intentional denial of support and attention in the sense that an athlete only obtains attention once he or she performs up to expectations. These are all examples of psychological abuse. In over 25 years of dealing with cases of athlete abuse as an athlete welfare officer, over 90% have constituted psychological violence. It's a standalone form of violence, And it's also associated with every other form of interpersonal violence you see here on the slide. So it is really important that we direct our attention and our research and our interventions to this form as well as every other. Unfortunately, psychological abuse tends to be normalized as a coaching practice, erroneously viewed as a method of developing athletic talent, when this runs contrary to everything we know about pedagogy, about how people best learn, how people are best motivated. We wouldn't accept this from teachers of our children. Why we accept this in sport is a question worthy of further attention. In Canada, at least, and perhaps this is true of other countries, sport for children and youth is the only child-populated domain that is completely autonomous and self-regulating. And this, at its very core, makes athletes, young athletes, vulnerable to experiences of interpersonal violence. So what can we do about this? What can we do to promote the human rights of children and youth? The strategies, of course, are far too many to address here. They're multi-layered, they're multi-pronged. They occur at the micro level where education may be valuable for coaches, for sport administrators, etc., where there is support for young people who experience interpersonal violence. It may also extend to policy and structures where there are safe, confidential places to report, where there are independent bodies that ensure compliance and move away from the self-regulating nature of sport. And further, to really embed human rights within children and youth sport is the value of adopting an ethic of care approach. An ethic of care approach extends beyond, it includes, but extends beyond child protection. It includes, but extends beyond safeguarding, and adds a dimension of the fulfillment of developmentally appropriate needs and rights, and maximizes the holistic health of children and youth. This is an approach that centers upon and prioritizes the well-being and holistic health of the child. And with such an approach, safeguarding is a wonderful side effect. So in closing, only when such a child-centered ethic of care approach is fully embedded in sport will the human rights of children and youth be respected. I'll close with this last quote. This is from Ali Raisman, a victim of Larry Nassar in USA Gymnastics, which interestingly has just declared bankruptcy, no doubt as a result of the legal and financial sanctions. Here she clearly highlights the need for everyone to have a responsibility to act upon their duty of care as adults in position of authority and power. And with such an approach, with global, broad sense of responsibility, hopefully we will avoid such situations in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have enough time for questions, so we do invite questions from you. Yes, yes, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Catherine Leslie. I'm a child protection specialist with the UN and currently onboarding as FIFA's new child safeguarding and protection manager. So thank you very much to all the panelists. My question is to James. Firstly, to thank you for the research that you're doing. And secondly, to ask a bit more about some of the challenges that you mentioned, especially in terms of implementation when it comes to engaging with clubs. From the research, has there some best practice? Is there some best practice coming out of that in terms of how to overcome these challenges, especially with engaging with the clubs?
So, thank you for your question. If I understand you correctly, I think there's two questions. Is there one about the best practice in terms of clubs implementing good children's rights practice, and one about how we engage with the clubs? Is that?
Exactly, yes.
Okay. So in terms of engagement with the clubs and how we went to, so a little bit more context, we've got case studies from CONMEBOL, CAF, AFC and UEFA. We couldn't get some in other parts of the world, but we're still trying. The main challenge in terms of interaction with clubs was that the ones who were doing good things, they were quite vocal about it. So there's one club who said they don't mind being mentioned, which is FC Rangers, and they're very open about what they're doing. Yeah? And one of the things that they're trying to do is to try to present the idea that creating children, put it another way, for them, before you're a footballer, you're a child. And their aim is to develop the best child they possibly can. Whether they go on to play for Rangers or another club, they don't care. So it's a very, very child-centered approach. And the key thing we're seeing in clubs with good evidence of best practice is it's a child-centered approach. Before they think about the football, they think about the child. I think that there's more complex things going on, but I think that's the simplest way to explain it. In terms of in terms of engaging clubs, like ones who wanted to be part of it, that's quite obvious. In terms of overcoming the clubs who we approached who didn't want to be part of it, the key thing was explaining that this was not about a witch hunt. It wasn't about trying to expose them. It was about promising to protect their confidentiality when things maybe weren't so good, but sharing the things that they were doing well. Now, again, one final point, so we have time for other questions. And what I would say there is that I can't stress enough that football clubs, in many cases, they want to do things better, but they're just genuinely scared. And I think until there's a more kind of open conversation at the highest level of FIFA about protecting children's rights, I think you're going to have that timidity from clubs. So I think at some point at the highest level, there needs to be some kind of really open conversation about protecting children's rights, and hopefully that will filter down to the professional levels. And one very final point is that my biggest concern is not just the professional clubs, but the amateur clubs. You know, what's going on at the amateur level of clubs? I think professional clubs are quite high profile. It's not in their interest for things to go wrong, but the majority of kids don't play at that level. I hope that's answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you, James. I think there was a question from the CGF. Yes?
Thank you. From David Grebenberg from the Commonwealth Games Federation. James, another question for you, just particularly on the child voice perspective. I thought that was quite an interesting point that you raised, and I was just wondering in terms of, I guess, a paradigm shift in sport of actually listening to children and incorporating children in the decision-making process. Is that something, can you give us your perspectives on that and maybe elaborate on some of the ways that you feel are most effective in reaching out and getting children to have that constructive, active voice in sport?
Yeah, I would say that we need to definitely find ways to incorporate the voice of children and their perspectives in the regulations that we design to protect them, without a shadow of a doubt. One thing I would add, a caveat to that, is that as part of our project with UNICEF that we're currently doing, my own institution, bless them, in their goodwill, to do research with children, you have to go through certain ethical procedures. Because of the duration of the project we're doing with FIFA, I didn't have enough time to do that. So what we had to do was speak to people over the age of 18 and ask them about their experiences. So we had to do it kind of retrospectively. So that's one way to try to get the voices of children. We are also thinking of doing another project, hopefully with UNICEF, where we actually speak directly to children themselves. And we're going to try and look at not just football, but a range of sports. Because one of my concerns is that experiences in a team sport versus an individual sport are going to be very different. We now have something called esports. Have any of you heard about esports? A whole new realm that's emerging. But even more subtle things like, who's everyone spoken to kids who do go-karting with aspirations to be in Formula One? There are so many different perspectives that and we can't do everything, but without a shadow of a doubt, we need to get the voices of children. And more importantly, this is really the final point, is that it has to be a more global perspective. One of my big concerns for the longest period of time now is whose voices do we actually hear when we do hear a children's voice? Whose voices count, whose voices count less? So I hope I've answered your question, but without a shadow of a doubt, we do need to incorporate the voices of children more.
Can I ask, our other panelists to comment or give their thoughts about, getting children's perspectives? Like, how would that would seem important in the duty of care approach or in your work at, the Federation or in Japan?
Yes, most of the research that we've conducted from the University of Toronto on the psychological violence has come directly from children through cases that have been brought forward to the sport organizations, and with both the children's assent and parental consent have enabled us to use this as the basis for research. So we're hearing directly from children experiencing forms of violence directly.
So I think for all of us it's a challenge to get the child's voice into the conversation, but I'd also just like to draw your attention that it's actually very hard to get the female's perspective in sport. Whilst sorry to bring up the issue of the gender balance in most of our international sports federations, and we're not perfect, we're 100% female. So when you have these difficult conversations to be had, maybe a gender-neutral board would be a better place to have those conversations with more women in the room who tend to be involved with nurturing the children. You might actually have a proxy in the boardroom for the children's voice. So sorry to bring that adage up again, but I think it's relevant in this context.
Okay. I have to admit that during the development of this process, the process of this data, this document, we haven't had any opportunity to have a consultation with children. But right from the beginning, we are thinking of the dialogue between the stakeholders is very important. And we are hoping to make this as a tool to establish a dialogue between stakeholders. Okay, we have been able to, perhaps to a certain extent, reach out to the sort of leadership of the Japanese sports society with this beautiful-looking document. But this has not been reached to any of the children, let alone to the parents, who we think are the key stakeholders of this, what it is talking about. So for next year, if everything goes well, what we are planning to do is to develop sort of child-friendly version of this, so as for us to tell children that what we are thinking as are important for them, so that they can equip themselves with a sort of the basic knowledge of what the adults are thinking of, and also we are trying to come up with some sort of tool or mechanism to reach out to the parents, so that they can start having a dialogue on what the children want to do or what the parents want their children to do. It may happen next year, or it may not happen next year, but we are hoping that it could happen in the next couple of years. Thank you.
If I may add another comment, I think it's important for sport federations and sport organizations to consider ways in which we can find ways to for athletes to have input into the experiences that affect them, and as such to have athlete representation on every level, on every committee, on every board, and if they're not children, at least to have athletes who are older or retired athletes who can contribute their voices from their previous experiences.
Since I have the mic, can I ask you a question or to elaborate a little more on your comment about self-regulation? What are the key issues with, sporting bodies self-regulating, and what would, an alternative look like?
When I use the phrase self-regulating to refer to sport, at least in Canada, it means several things. It means that athletes who have concerns about the nature of their experiences end up reporting their experiences to people who are positions of power within that sport organization. So there's an inherent conflict of interest when the CEO for a sport organization or someone who's employed within that sport organization accepts the concern. Then there's a tension between the athlete's welfare and the perhaps employment of a coach who's been extraordinarily successful. The most poignant example I can give you is a case that came forward around sexual violence, and it went to the sport organization, and of course they didn't want to do anything because the Olympics were 3 months away and the coach in question had half the Olympic team. It's also self-regulating in the sense that there's no professional oversight body for coaches. So when there's a concern about a coach, it also goes to the sport organization itself. So it's rife with either actual or perceived conflicts of interest, which in itself is a barrier to reporting cases of concern for athlete well-being.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So, child-centered approach, participation, and really good practices, in safeguarding and looking, at the next year. So potentially, should we self-regulate and accept that it is now time to, close this panel? Thank our panelists by a round of applause.